Alicia Garza is the co-founder of Black Futures Lab, Black Lives Matter, and the Black Lives Matter Global Network, an international project to end state violence against Black people. She is also the co-founder of Supermajority, an organization for women's activism, and she serves as a strategy and partnerships director for the National Domestic Workers Alliance. She also hosts the Politics and Pop Culture podcast, which I love. It's so good, called Lady Don't Take No. And I just want to say, Alicia, you have like 7 jobs. That's literally right there. That's 7. That's a good 7 full-time jobs that you are working at any given time. And we're so grateful that you joined us today. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start by talking a little bit about just how this summer has been. Obviously, as one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, you have been centering some of the issues, all of the issues really, that have kind of taken even a bigger place front and center stage in national politics, and also just sort of like national conversation more generally this summer. And how do you feel today? Today's September 3rd, so we're like almost at the end of summer. How do you feel looking at the political landscape today versus how you felt at the very beginning of the summer, early June?
Wow. Well, it does feel like time. Time it's not a construct, but it's ever flowing. And I'll say that, in the beginning of this summer, we saw unprecedented rebellions spread, not just across the country, but across the world. And I think it has a lot to do with a few things. I mean, one, at this point, Black Lives Matter is kind of in the muscle memory of this nation. And, 7 years ago, we couldn't get politicians to say Black Lives Matter. We couldn't get a lot of people to say Black Lives Matter. We got a lot of all lives matter, blue lives matter, every life except for Black Lives Matter. And so, coming into this period, it's been a little bit surreal to see the ways in which Black Lives Matter has spread more completely. I think with that being said, we've also seen not just widespread embracing of Black Lives Matter, but I think we're still waiting, right, for the kinds of changes that this movement has been demanding for a very long time. And right now, on this day, I'm just reflecting that a lot of what we are seeing is that we are essentially being used as a political football in this election season. And the leader of this country is attacking our organization. He's attacking our movement while allowing for vigilantes and white nationalists and white supremacists to go unchecked. And I think that really does say a lot about where we are as a nation as it relates to racism, as it relates to addressing issues of safety and what it means to actually be safe in our communities. And I think what we found is that this movement has progressed in such a way where it's now offering very, very concrete solutions as to how we address the ongoing epidemic of police violence and police brutality, but bigger than that, how we address the systemic dismantling of the kind of infrastructure in our communities that not only keeps us safe, but also that allows us to live full and dignified lives. And so from housing to healthcare to education, and on and on, I think what we're finding here is that there's really a need, right, for bold and courageous moves, not just because there's a contest for who will lead this nation, but because our very lives depend on it, right? Here we are at the intersection of a global pandemic, a crisis in our democracy, a deepening and worsening climate crisis, an economic recession, and then certainly, of course, a crisis of racial terror. And those are things that still need to be addressed.
It's interesting you make the point about political football, because it strikes me that maybe that's where some of my wariness comes in about this summer, and even the response, and even sometimes the good response. I mean, I think it's really is just amazing, and it just puts into perspective how a few years ago saying Black Lives Matter was like a political death sentence in some communities, right? Like you couldn't, like, you know, it's just remarkable to see how much, so much has changed. But I wonder from you if you think some of the fundamentals, again, and I think that this is the political football point, have not. That 7 years ago, this was used as a political football in many ways, and right now it's also still being used as a political football, maybe slightly more in a progressive favor, but still requiring Black people, Black communities, and Black leaders to repeatedly assert not just their dignity, but their good intentions in a way that other people don't have to.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I've spent the last week dealing with messages that frankly miss the point. You know, we've seen all kinds of things this week, including, you know, a disingenuous call for a ban on nighttime protests. We're seeing, you know, people say with gusto, right? That they feel like they have to condemn rioting or looting, and they're associating that with protest. And at the same time, right, we don't see as quick of action to deal with the fact that a 17-year-old boy went to a protest in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and shot two people who were protesting. And he, you know, has not been the topic of any conversations as it relates to this president. But yet this president is convening task forces through the Department of Justice to study allegedly, you know, radical extremists. And, you know, the president has been on television this last week talking about Black Lives Matter and how he believes it's a terrorist organization that he wants to prosecute. And so, you know, a lot of, I think, what we're dealing with in this moment is a reckoning, but I'm not quite clear that we've made the choice to actually lean into it. And, you know, it's Black leaders who just 3 months ago, right, were being lauded for, you know, creating the kinds of conditions in this country where people are squarely facing the realities of systemic racism. Today, we're in a moment where the Attorney General of this nation literally said that he does not believe that systemic racism exists in policing. And so that's the moment that we're facing right now. And I think that it makes imperative, right, that for those of us who care about what's going to happen in November, but beyond that, for those of us who care about the direction this country is headed in, we have to ask ourselves, are we going to be passive observers while we're being gaslit into believing, right, that the real issue today, broken windows, as opposed to the dozens of Black people who have been murdered just this year alone. And so many of those people have been murdered on camera. And I think we also have to determine that we will make Black Lives Matter more than a slogan, that will actually make it the governing principle of this nation. And that's the work that is left to do.
You know, it's interesting thinking about Breonna Taylor in particular, and how we talk about Black death at the hands of the state. And I think obviously death is fundamentally the worst thing that the state can do to you. They can kill you, right? And they can kill you with impunity. They can kill you without ever being punished. And they can kill you because this is a racist system that believes in responding to Black people with racist solutions, including not seeing them as human enough to keep alive. But there's this other thing too, right? Which is like, had Breonna Taylor lived, but she had been grievously injured, let's say, right? She'd be locked up for drug dealing. Her boyfriend would be locked up for attempted murder, and her that night would have ruined her life regardless. Death is obviously much worse than any other thing that could have happened to her. But in the spectrum of what we talk about when we talk about police violence and racist police violence, it's, people come out of the woodwork and say, well, only X amount of people are killed by the police every year, or whatever the kind of like statistical justification for Black death is. But it goes beyond that, right? And I think that that's really fundamental to what, you've always talked about when you talk about Black Lives Matter.
I mean, I agree. I mean, I just read that heartbreaking piece in the New York Times about Breonna Taylor and her life. And what I found so fascinating about it was that she really was the story of redemption that this country talks about all the time. This was somebody who was the first person in her family to graduate from high school. She took care of her younger sister and her infant godchild. She was an essential worker, right? She was an EMT who worked at 2 local hospitals. She is somebody who, had just fallen in love. I mean, she's somebody who, frankly, resisted every obstacle placed in front of her. And she also is the story of America, right? She is the story of what our communities are grappling with every single day. And, it is true that, we're hearing, of course, more recently that the police there had offered a deal to her ex-boyfriend, trying to get him to posthumously, right, implicate her in his drug dealing practice, which of course he refused to do. And then I think there's the question of, who's left behind. We haven't asked the question of what happened to her younger sister, what's happened to her, her godchild, what's happened to her mother, what's happened to her partner who, watched as Breonna was murdered right next to him. So, so much of this gets couched as these individualized and exceptional kinds of cases. But I think what we find is that they are patterns. It is pattern and practice. And, the other thing I want to say about this is that so often people don't survive to tell the story. What we found is that Jacob Blake is still alive after being shot 7 times in the back in front of his 3 children. He is still alive to be able to tell the story. And, as he's recovering from his injuries, he too, up until just a couple of days ago, was handcuffed to his bed. That changed, of course, mostly as a result of public outcry. But we have to ask ourselves, is this the kind of safety that we are driving towards? Do you feel safer knowing that a man who was shot in his back 7 times and who has lost his ability, he's lost, functioning from the waist down? Do you feel safer now knowing that? Do you feel safer now that an essential worker was murdered in her home, in her bed while she was sleeping? If this is public safety, right? I think we have to ask ourselves a lot of questions about, what about this process and what about this pattern and practice is actually making us safer? And I think the answer to that is nothing. And so there does have to be a different way of approaching this. And that's why I'm so proud that this movement has actually introduced really clear ways to get us closer to the things that we purport that we want in our lives.
Yeah, that's where I was gonna ask next, is that there's always this, or bad faith actors always want to say like, well, what's the solution? And I find that a frustrating conversation anyway, because I don't think you should have to have figured out the solution to identify the problem. But I also think that there has been so much work, and particularly interesting work done this summer, more recent work, and I'm talking about the Breathe Act in particular, around what a solution looks like, and not just what a solution to police violence looks like, but if we believe in safety and if we know we value public safety, what does public safety look like? So can you talk a little bit about the BREATHE Act? Because I want to make sure everybody who watches this knows about it and also understands kind of the principles behind it and what it really means.
Absolutely. So shout out, of course, and always to the Movement for Black Lives, which really is a coalition of more than 150 Black-led organizations and, hundreds of individuals, right, who have come together over the last 5 or 6 years now to build a movement that can transform the rules that have been rigged against our communities for a very long time. And the BREATHE Act is really, I think, a pivotal milestone in this movement's trajectory. And the BREATHE Act essentially asks us to reconsider what safety and wellness and dignity looks like. And it is, I would say, this generation's version of the Civil Rights Act. It is an identification of where it is that we need to divest our resources from and where we need to invest resources into in order to achieve the goals that we've laid out. And so, one of the things that I feel really proud of in relationship to this piece of legislation is that, for so many years, people would say things like, what's the solution? And what do we need to do about it, right? And now here we are, and we've proposed, right, this very comprehensive way to address public safety, but also community wellness, which essentially involves divesting, right, from the punishment economy and investing in a caring economy that takes care of all of us. And so, we spent most of the summer talking about the viability of a demand around defunding police. And I always say, as an organizer for 20 years, right, any kind of demand that's out there that makes you uncomfortable is the right kind of demand. And it's the right kind of demand because it forces you to think about where you stand. And it also forces you to interrogate how you understand what the problem is. And so forces you to start to articulate how you might address it differently. I'm not so caught up in language that I don't understand the core problems that we're facing in our communities, which is that we've been being defunded for a very long time.
Sorry.
That's okay. We've been being defunded for a very long time. And when we want to, improve our quality of life, we don't have hospitals. We don't have full service grocery stores. We don't have schools where all kids have books and where the first person they see in the morning isn't a teacher, but it's a police officer. In my community, we're one of a few jurisdictions across the country that has its own police department for the school district. And so, in so many ways, our infrastructure in our communities has been being intentionally weakened for decades, and it has caused a set of conditions that result in what we are fighting today. And so a very clear call to reinvest our resources in order to reimagine how our communities can be well is, I think, the clarion call of this generation. And I think it should be the kind of hallmark pivotal point that our parents talked about, right, when they were marching, not just for voting rights, right, not just for an end to segregation, but fundamentally, the last period of civil rights was fundamentally about rebuilding infrastructure in our communities so that we could be powerful in every aspect of our lives. And I think that the BREATHE Act, really asks us to reconsider what we're prioritizing in terms of how we're distributing our resources and what the impacts of that are on our communities.
Yeah, it's such an interesting point because it makes the phrasing makes people uncomfortable. Some people uncomfortable, even though we see that shifting quickly, right? I mean, I found a document a couple months ago that said, like, it was talking about defunding the police as kind of like a political goal, and had a 10-year kind of timeline of what's possible, right? And here we are a couple of years later and things are shifting. So it's the timing is moving. I mean, it's remarkable how quickly it moves, and then it's sort of remarkable how quickly it doesn't. And I think it's so important for people to think about the idea that people believe that if they had that let me figure out a better way to say this. I do think people think in their head, if I would always be on the right side of history, right? So there's no way the civil rights movement would have made me uncomfortable. There's no way that what they were saying would have seemed radical to me, because that was correct. They were doing the right thing. And I know what the right thing is inherently. But it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of work by organizers and thinkers and innovators to really set fertile ground for people to have the ability to imagine a different world. And what I try to kind of tell people all the time is what a blessing and how great it is to be able to open your mind and imagine something different. How great it is to be able to imagine a world where we don't need police, where we don't rely on state terror to get what we want from people, that we have provided basic resources to other human beings. And, I think about that in the context of your work at Black Futures Lab, because I think so much of what you're trying to do is not just give Black people a voice and make them sort of more of the conversation and the consideration around political decisions, but also imagine, I mean, it's in the name, but imagine a future, right, where Black people, are valued, supported, and have the resources that they need in a country that has never once in its, history done that adequately.
That's very true.
If you want to talk a little bit about your work there, yeah. I'd love to hear more about Black Futures for people who don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we start from the perspective of what do we dream about and what do we want to see for our futures? And then we walk ourselves backwards to say, what would it take to get there? And the Black Futures Lab and the Black to the Future Action Fund is all about making Black communities powerful in politics so that we can be powerful in the rest of our lives. And so much of building power for Black communities involves listening to and engaging Black communities and trusting that Black folks can be the heroes in our own stories, that we actually don't need to wait for somebody to come and save us, right? And so much of the story of our liberation struggle is centered around like unique individuals, right? Who we assume had superhuman qualities, like Martin Luther King or like Malcolm X, right? But I think what we found is that frankly, some of the most profound changes in this country have come from regular people who were sick and tired of being sick and tired, like our sister Fannie Lou Hamer. And what we are doing at the Black Futures Lab is organizing the Fannie Lou Hamers of this country to help lead us in the process of changing rules that have been rigged against our communities for generations, of being a new governance structure in this country that can help determine how resources are distributed and, how our economies function and how our democracy functions, and can make sure that none of our communities are left behind. And so our whole institution really began from a listening project called the Black Census, where it's now the largest survey of Black people in America in 155 years. And we talk to Black people in every state in this country, from every demographic, across all kind of social and economic and other demographic lines. And what we found from that process is that, you know, more often than not, people said, nobody has ever asked me what I experience every day and what I want for my future. And that, as you know, Josie, does not bode well for a political system that is healthy and functioning.
Right.
The other
Of
thing that we
course.
learned, of course, was that, you know, the things that are keeping Black communities up at night are low wages that are not enough to support a family, the lack of affordable and quality healthcare and housing, and that, you know, when it comes to what we want to see done about it, you know, a lot of us, right, have said that we want government to take more responsibility for ensuring that all of its citizens are well. And so from, you know, making sure that wealthy individuals are redistributing their wealth all the way to ensuring that, you know, everybody who needs housing and healthcare has it, right? Black communities have an incredible vision for what can make this country well when it has been very sick for a very long time. And for us, then the process of listening is what we use to determine the fights that we pick. And, you know, we put together a document called the Black Agenda 2020, which really lays out all of the solutions that our survey respondents talked about, from housing to healthcare to wages to education to the legal system. You know, interestingly, we talked earlier about defunding the police. And, you know, in this campaign moment, there's such hesitation to even talk about what changes need to happen as it relates to policing and public safety. But I can tell you, in a survey of Black folks that was not radical activists, right, that the number
Right.
one thing that people said that they wanted was to hold police accountable when they commit crimes in our communities. And people talked a lot, right, about redistributing resources in such a way that our communities could be safe and whole, and where police would not actually be needed or necessary. And so,
Right.
while even our survey respondents weren't necessarily using the words defund, right, they're certainly
Right.
using the principles behind it, which is deeply invest in our communities and divest from the things that are punishing us, that are hurting us, and that are keeping us from being safe, like everybody deserves to be safe. And so we don't just kind of put that information in a report, right? We've been using that as an organizing tool and making sure that in this critical election cycle where everything is at stake for our communities, that we are using the correct litmus tests to determine who gets our support. And to date, we have more than 60,000 Black voters across the nation who have taken a pledge to use the Black agenda as the way that they will determine how they select the people that represent them. We also know that what happens in November and what happens at the federal level is important, but it's not everything. And that fundamentally, no matter what happens in November, we still have to keep pushing and plugging to change the rules, but also to be the rule makers. And so right now we've got 41 Black fellows from across the nation who are currently, as we speak, learning about how to write, win, and implement new rules in cities and states across this country. And starting in January, you are going to see policy campaigns coming out of our shops that are being led by the Fannie Lou Hamers of this country to change the rules in state houses and city halls across this nation. And so, you know, I think what this moment is calling for us to do is to be more active participants in our present and in our future. And our goal at the Black Futures Lab and our goal at the Black to the Future Action Fund is to make sure that our communities know that we are the heroes in our own stories, and that when we come together with a clear vision and a clear plan for how to achieve that vision, there's nothing that can stop us.
You know, I really love the work Black Futures Lab does for so many reasons. I think Black Futures Lab is one of those places that gives me a feeling of hope when I think about what the potential of the future looks like. And I think in a moment like right now, where the pandemic is still ravaging communities, especially communities that look like ours, when police violence, you know, on one hand, you're being told the police don't have any power anymore and they, you know, there's no safety. And on the other hand, we're still seeing police violence left and right. We're still seeing people, you know, at the mercy of state terror. And we're looking at an election that is terrifying, I think, for many reasons. Black Futures Lab is one of those places that reminds us, I think, that we're still moving forward, and we're moving forward with people who are invested in making our communities better. And I think it's really interesting in particular that there's a focus on like local and state work and policy at Black Futures Lab, not just federal policy. And I think it'd be great for people to understand the power of local legislation, local change for communities that, like, you know, I think people really think about the federal government as having all the power, and local and state governments sort of have like what's left. But what we actually know, right, is that most of the decisions that determine our future are functionally made locally.
That's right. That's right. Well, you know, I wasn't sure if I should like praise the framers or not.
Right. They have their ups and downs, you know, they have their pluses and minuses.
They're complicated, but at the end of the day, it is true. It is true that, you know, the way that our governance system has been set up is that allegedly there is not supposed to be this overarching monarchy that is imposing upon you from way up high, and that actually you should be able to govern locally, right where you live. You should be able to decide, you know, where the trash is being picked up, and, you know, where the water is flowing to, and what's happening in your schools. And that is actually true. And, you know, for so many Americans in this country, you know, people see politics as a thing that you kind of have to hold your nose and get through every 4 years. But what's challenging about that, right, is that there are decisions being made about you, without you, just a few blocks from your home. And, you know, not enough of us are engaged in that process. And so much of what happens in cities and states is actually what helps to create momentum, right, for what happens at the federal level. And so certainly, you know, I know Ronald Reagan kind of gave us the trickle down, the trickle down approach, but I'm much more in favor of what I call the champagne approach, which is that things bubble up from the ground. And, you know, and so much of how we change what's happening at the federal level starts with changing it right where we live. I mean, look at, you know, the same-sex marriage movement. Look at, you know, even civil rights, right? All of that happened at the federal level because there was a wave of momentum that came from cities and states across the nation. And so if you're somebody like me who hates politics, like I literally hate politics, and I hated them before Michelle Obama did, or maybe not before her, but I probably hate them more than she does. If you're somebody who feels like me in that way, just know, right, that, you know, the things that you're dissatisfied about, you actually have a chance to shift right where you are, and you don't have to wait for what happens in the presidential election. You can certainly engage in what happens when your mayor gets elected. If you don't like what's happening with policing in your community, make sure that you have a say over who is leading your city, because that's the person who's determining and setting the tone for what policing looks like in your community, from the police chief on down. So, you know, I would just say that, you know, what is important about power building, right, is that it's not actually out of our grasp, and it's not far away from us. We can be powerful in every aspect of our lives, and it starts with being powerful right here where we live.
Right. I think about that a lot. Just, I mean, politics is exhausting, right? Like and I think for Black people in particular, it'd be great to not have to think about politics all the time. It'd be great to to be able to trust, right, that the systems have your best interest in mind, and you don't have to worry about school funding, and you don't have to worry about what the school, the Board of Ed is doing, and you don't have to worry about what the police chief is doing, because you know that what they're doing is in your best interest. We don't have that luxury. Like I always think about how like I love to learn to knit, and I would love to just knit blankets. That sounds like a really great thing to do, right? But I'm not going to be able to do that for a while until we figure the system out, because there's no time. And so, or there's no time for that to be my full-time job. That's my goal.
That's
to be
great.
A full-time knitter. And so I think the ROI, I mean, it's true. The return on investment and getting involved in local politics and holding people locally accountable for the decisions they make is massive. We've seen it. I mean, and I think DA races in particular is my obviously go-to example. Like when you start identifying problems that prosecutors are responsible for in your community, things can actually change. Now, they might not change all the way. There's always more work to do. There's a question about whether the system should exist at all. All of that is right. But the ability to kind of influence who makes decisions about your life is I think, more significant than a lot of people would have us believe, especially given how much focus is on, for example, the president.
So many of us don't realize that, the people that are making decisions about how our systems work are actually accountable to us. So, the prosecutor in my community, for example, largely goes unchallenged every election. And so it's become this thing where the prosecutor's office almost became a dynasty, where the prosecutor themselves kind of selects who their successor is going to be. And that has deep impacts on what happens in our communities. And I can tell you, when I participated in a direct action here, this was a prosecutor who, instead of trying to deal with the ways in which our systems and the way that they function here locally are disproportionately attacking Black and Brown communities. She decided to take up a campaign to, prosecute 10 of us who engaged in a direct action that was intended to call attention to these kinds of crises. But meanwhile, right, in this same office, not with the same DA, but with the same kind of approach, when Oscar Grant was murdered on a BART platform just a few blocks from my house, they couldn't seem to get it together to really hold accountable the officers who were involved in that murder. And it took protest to actually pressure this office to take action. And that case in particular became the first, I believe, in California where a police officer was held accountable for a crime they committed in our community. So if you don't think that politics locally matters, I think that's an incredible way of understanding how it does and why it does and what you can do about it.
Absolutely. I am so grateful. I know that we're about to hit time. I'm so grateful for you joining. When they told me that I was going to get to talk to you, I was like, this is my favorite thing to do anyway. So this is perfect.
I'm so glad we got to do this. Thank you.
And I want to give you a chance to talk about how to, sorry, I'm trying to think about the best way to do this. Let me give you this first, and then I'll do your introduction. I want to give you a chance to talk about Alicia, to talk about the best way to support Black Futures Lab and support your work, how people can get involved, and what how people can be useful to your work, and all the different ways that can mean.
Absolutely. So you can join our community by visiting blackfutureslab.org. You can also join our political community by joining Black, the number 2, thefuture.org. If you want to get involved with us, there are a number of ways that you can. Check out our Electoral Action Center on blackfutureslab.org to find out everything about what it means to participate in this upcoming election cycle, everything about who represents you and where they stand on the issues that you care about. And tell a friend. We're working super hard over the next few months to make sure that there is no person left untouched, and that we have registered thousands of voters across the country who have previously been left out or left behind. And you can help us by joining us at blackfutureslab.org.
Thank you so much, Alicia.